Greetings and welcome to the TELUS Prologue Showcase. I'll be presenting to you what the game currently looks like. Now, something you'll immediately notice by the gameplay is that we've shifted from utilizing a auto-progressing story into having the player essentially choose when they continue. It's one of the feedbacks we got from our playtesters that a lot of people prefer to read at their own speed. So, as we're going through this, I'm just going to spam click a little bit so that we get to one part in particular. But one thing I can talk about in the meanwhile is that, as you can already tell, the animations truly enliven the entire scene. As you can see, this is also something the playtest told us. The animations are done incredibly well, and they beautifully display a sense of character that Tellus has. A lot of our time and effort went into creating Tellus and making Tellus feel alive, both in its facial expressions as well as in its animations and, of course, in its model. Back to the gameplay, though, meanwhile, as you see Tellus in the background animating, we can choose here how we respond to this last statement that Tellus has made. And depending on our choice, we will get different text, and the story continues in a different direction. Not too much, everything will converge until the very end, when the story ends on a completely different note, depending on your interactions. But that is essentially the meat of the game. You go through the story, and occasionally you make choices to change the narrative in a rather major ways. But enough of that. Let me show you how the sausage is made. So when I was actually setting out to create the mechanical side of this game, I decided that what I really wanted to do is create a set of tools that would make it incredibly easy to then make this actual story. So these are the tools I've made. Essentially, we have an interaction system which we can start and stop, which means that if we stop it, it's no longer there, it doesn't do anything, and it won't interfere with any other parts of the games. We have the blue text template, which essentially, if we toggle this on, it'll display blue text. If not, it will be pink text. And the first one that I created for testing purposes, which will just display white text. There's a couple of more peculiarities in there. For example, shifting pitches and sounds. We have dramatic pause, which, as you might think, it just pauses for a while. Change in animation, so we used enumerators here, so we can very easily at any point just go, okay, we want this animation. And we can decide if we want them to loop or not. Changing the emotion of the face, again, using enumerators for this. And lastly, here we have a decision node. So once we get there, we can put in two options, and the player will be forced to choose between these options. The idea is only there, so we can later try and figure out where we should go from there. As I'm zooming out, here you can see what the story structure actually looks like. So once again, a really big advantage of using this tools-oriented system of creating things is that at any point, anyone in the project can go in here, edit it, and change things. So if at any point Keenan, who was responsible for animations, goes, oh man, this animation looks crap, he can just go in here and go, okay, I want it to be this animation instead. So anyone can easily understand where the story is at and how to change and affect it. Furthermore, it also makes the writing process incredibly easy for me because I can write and edit things within this tool. So if, for example, during playtest we noticed spelling errors, which we did a lot, by the way, I can just Control F, type in the spelling error in question, like let's say this, and immediately I can go to the text in question and edit it. So this is also extremely useful for navigation of the story. But yeah, it also means you can immediately write the story out in the file itself. Okay, moving on from this, let me just quickly talk about the story since we're already here. The main story of the Tellus Prologue is split into three main areas. Now, first of all, I didn't want to make it a self-contained story. Truth is, we already knew from the get-go whatever we were going to create was going to be really, really small and is meant to be served as an additional part to the main game. So really, what I set out to do with the story for this is to be a character exploration of Tellus that serves to enrich the further story. So really, in those three sections, this one here, I set out to do that we learn something new about Tellus every time. So here in this first section, we essentially learn about what Tellus was meant to be. how Tellus was meant to operate. We see the facade. And we also learn something about the true Tellus, which is the mischievousness, which at the end of this section starts to break out slowly but surely and starts to go noticed. In this next section, we learn about Tellus's environment in which she was created. We learn about the facility in which she currently is. We learn about the people doctoring around on her. And we also learn once again something about Tellus's character. We learn how manipulative she can truly be, how transactional, and how she can lead a conversation to the direction she wants as she's slowly but surely manipulating the character into doing what she wants. And in the last section, we learn about, well, you, the character you're currently playing as. Because the last section, you have a very important choice that will essentially determine the end of the game, in which you decide what is more important to you, the good of the many or the good of the few. As you essentially decide, are you going to send this faulty robot up into space to take care of a couple of children, or will she be used for something much, much worse? So it's a bit of a moral dilemma that tells us really more about you than about Tellus. But we also do learn one last thing about Tellus in this scene, which is Tellus's borderline obsession with her task and what she is willing to do to get to actually do it. So that's essentially the entire story. It's really just a character dissection of who Tellus is and what she does. And the choices are also here. Mostly just for gameplay. Yes. Let's see what's next on the agenda. Yes, let us very quickly do go a little bit more in detail about the actual blueprints. We are well in time. Here is, for example, how the text is being set. So we do a couple of options based on what settings you selected, what template you got. But essentially we're just going through and we're checking, are the lines already set? If not, we unset them. If they're not set, we fill them out. We go in here into the new macro 0, which I could not have possibly named any better. And we are going through a custom loop that I've created. That's essentially just, it's kind of like a core routine, you know. It pauses every couple of times before executing its next task, like for a minute. And that's how we get this cool letter display effect going. Before we come back out here, this is also where we do some of the sound-based effects. Oh, and this part is lovely. So, as I mentioned briefly before, we changed the game from going automatically into going click by click. The problem was I already created all of this system to go automatically. So I needed to change that into going click by click. I didn't want to redo the entire system. So instead, I did this. This entire bit is essentially just using time dilation. So every time that the story is filled out, we essentially just slow down time to the point that it may as well be completely still until the player clicks and it resumes normally again. So that was my workaround into not having to reprogram the entire thing. And I think honestly that's the most interesting of all those functions. There's a little bit more granular stuff we could discuss here, but really it's nothing earth-breaking or all that interesting, really. Let's go into the main project as I'm going to showcase to you. Tell us a little bit more in depth. So one thing you'll notice is that something also from the animation way that we've done it is that the face and the actual rig and model of Tellus are two completely separate entities, which means we can change the face independently from her animations, which adds a little bit more of liveliness into everything. For example, okay, but the model, again, we put a lot of care and craftsmanship into the model, as you can see here. Kian really outdid himself on this one, and it is very beautiful. Oh, while we are at visual things, I've created a plenty of shaders that we're utilizing, which you're seeing right now. Essentially, one is a cell shading shader that we're utilizing to essentially get this blue effect. Nothing too complicated, really. I did decide to jam two different colors together to create the effect that you're currently seeing. Didn't need to, just as you can see, here's different other color palettes we experimented around with before we settled on blue. Lastly, another effect you may or may not have noticed is the pixelization effect. So if you look on the left, I can make it a little bit more noteworthy. There we go. So essentially what we're doing is we're adding a very subtle layer of pixelization onto the entire project, which gives it that retro style that really works with the entire computer aesthetic. Yes. Lastly, Honestly, I believe that does show up everything for the most part. There's a lot of details in all of these things, but that at least explains the project of what we set out to do. I also want to showcase this real quickly, essentially how it all comes together. As you're playing the story, you see Talos react in different animations and different face changes, and it's incredibly lively. It has a lot of personality. It is very lovely. Like I love this one especially, and it's yeah, it was a very good one. I hope you will enjoy it, and yeah,